Hello and welcome. Joining me this evening on this special interview is Dr. Shankar Acharya, someone who needs no introduction in the world of economics. He's been our longest serving chief economic advisor and writes a very popular column on economics, amongst, of course, many other things. And he's now got a book out, An Economist at Home and Abroad. So first, Dr. Acharya, thank you for joining me. Why did you decide to write this book? Of course, it's an interesting time to write about economics, especially because it makes headlines every day.
Well, Sonia, I think the reasons are very straightforward. Last year, when the 2.5-month lockdown started, for those of us above 70 also, that stretched for several more months. So one was stuck at home. And there's only so much Netflix and Amazon Prime you can watch. And then people have been suggesting to me that why don't I write a memoir? And I've been toying with it. And so I got down to doing it. And I started with an intent of essentially sharing chapters with close friends and relatives. So not as a publication, but I got very nice feedback, very encouraging feedback. And so halfway through, I thought, well, why not try and make it a published book? And that's why I think you might find that more than most memoirs, perhaps, it had a lot of the personal in it.
Dr. Acharya, just to pick up on a point there, because while of course it's a memoir, but some of the insight, a chapter you've written actually on the GDP numbers and how growth has been hit because of the lockdown and COVID, where I think you were ahead of others perhaps in assessing what the impact of the lockdown would actually be. Now, we've just had the latest GDP numbers out and making headlines because the government, of course, is saying this is a record economic growth. The opposition pointing out that it's actually come on the back of a negative rate of growth last year. What's your stand actually on this?
I wish when people write or put something on screen on GDP growth rates and so on, during this period of the COVID, if you like, catastrophe, it would be useful if people focused on not just the growth rates, but the levels of GDP. So then you could see what's actually happening. Because the growth rates are going to bounce around. Since once you drop by 24%, as we did in the first quarter of last year, any recovery will show up usually as a high growth rate. And that's what we are seeing in this quarter. That is Q1 of FY22. You're seeing a 20% growth over Q1 of FY20. And that looks very good. And it's a record and all that. But you see, that's because you went down by 24%. And an increase of 20% is actually not getting you anywhere close to where you should be to get back to that level. Because for that, you need, it's because you do your simple arithmetic and you would know that to get back to where you were 2 years ago or a year ago, you would need, something like 2 years ago. Something like a 29 or 30% increase, which is why many commentators have pointed out that, yes, you've had 20% year-on-year growth in this quarter, but compared to 2 years ago, that is FY20 Q1, you are still somewhere around 9% lower in real terms. So it's still, we're still being battered and bounced by COVID, if you like, and lockdown.
So almost in a sense, Dr. Acharya, we talk about long COVID and the impact on people's health, but there's also a long COVID impact on the Indian economy. So on the one hand, while we debate GDP numbers, the fact remains that, for instance, in the informal sector, the economic pain for people, for millions of Indians is actually very real. We're seeing rising prices at a time when of increasing joblessness and salary cuts as well. Where do you see what needs to be done to tackle this, especially given that we saw in our decades of high growth rates that our poverty alleviation also grew? How do we actually tackle poverty and the pain people are going through now?
I think you're absolutely right, Sonia, that we shouldn't focus on the GDP numbers. I mean, GDP, whether level or growth, is very important. I'm not saying it isn't. And certainly, I think two big issues, just to finish off on GDP, that we should kind of focus on GDP is that when do we get back for the full year to a level which is roughly like what it was 2 years ago? Because then you can say you've really recovered fully year on year. And I see that probably happening in this fiscal year, 22. maybe even a little better, but maybe not. More important to me is what will happen to GDP growth beyond that. Because that will tell you, if you like, more about the impact of these turbulent 2 years in between, where essentially you lost 2 years of normal growth because you went down and you recovered. But where you're, I think, 100% right is that that's just aggregate GDP output. And anyway, there are a lot of issues with the calculation and the estimation. But what matters ultimately in terms of welfare is what's happening to standards of living of people and people at large, all of us, not just the upper middle class or the middle class or, the very rich. And there, I think it's a very, very damaging story that we've seen in these last 2 years. As you know, if you look at the employment numbers, they weren't looking very pretty even by 2017-18. They were, very poor. And I think what's happened in the last 2 years is there's been more damage. And we actually don't have official numbers for this period. But what we do have from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, CMI employment numbers, it's clear that if you look at the total of employment in the economy and divide by the working age population, that ratio, and that's the one I focus on, has dropped from somewhere around 40% just before COVID hit us in March of last year to somewhere around 36, 37% about now. And that means that remembering that we have a working age population above 15 or about 1 billion, we've gone from somewhere around 400 million to somewhere around 370 million in that absolute numbers, which means that a lot of jobs just haven't come back yet because of all that's happened. And almost all of that is focused, not all, but most of it is focused on what we call the informal sector, which accounts for 80-85% of our labor force. And that's where people are hurting. They've lost jobs. And what's even more important is probably a very high percentage are now getting average incomes, wages or whatever form of income, lower than they were getting 2 years ago.
And of course, Dr. Acharya, you've been chief economic advisor at a time when you saw 3 prime ministers actually change an era of coalition governments. So it's a very different time now when it's an era of strong leadership, the current government having a very strong parliamentary majority. So in that sense, having a greater freedom with economic decisions. How do you actually see that strong majority play out in terms of economic policy and governance? The question about it being pushed through with the opposition just being token in a sense because they don't need them to pass bills as opposed to your time?
Well, Sonia, I mean, that's a very broad and interesting question. But various people have commented that actually sometimes our economic policy at the national level appears to be better when we have coalitions. Because, now, this is, of course, only a point of view. But if you look at the period of the 90s, which is when, I was chief economic advisor for about 8 years. That's an awful long time ago, so I was an old fogey. But we had 3 successive coalition governments, as you know. I mean, even the Congress government of Mr. Narasimha Rao was, in effect, a coalition for much of the time, at least. Then you had the 2 years of United Front government, where you had 2 prime ministers, Mr. Devegowda, before that, and after that, Mr. Gujral. And then you had 6 years of Vajpayee's government, which was, again, a coalition. And yet I would say that, in fact, I say so in my book, I think, that I do think that if you take the Narasimha Rao years together with the Vajpayee years, and also the in-between 2 years when maybe not a lot of forward movement, but no backward movement of any consequence either in economic policy. You had a 13-year period where I personally think we had the most forward movement in terms of sensible economic policy reforms, whatever word you wish to use. And you got a consistency of economic policy. And as a result, you had an even longer period of economic outcomes, and good economic outcomes, going up to perhaps 2010. I don't actually think that economic policy post-2004 UPA period was that great. They didn't do that much by way of productivity enhancing reforms in the economy. Dr. Manmohan Singh's period as Prime Minister, which is, I think, to me anyway, somewhat disappointing compared to what was his finance minister, which were wonderful. But because of the earlier basis of good policy for a consistent 13 years or so by previous governments, and also there was a bit of a global boom going on, if you recall, in the early part of the century, before the financial crisis, outcomes were good in the Indian economy. But a prolonged period of not doing good reforms has its costs later. And, after 2010, as you know, even during the UPA period, growth fell off. You had all this talk about policy paralysis, scams, this, that, but underlying growth fell off.
So that's interesting, Dr. Acharya, because of course, the UPA headed by world-renowned economist Dr. Manmohan Singh, and you'd said that he as finance minister under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was actually the best economic policies for India, so very different when you're actually in the Prime Minister's seat. But just to take up from a point you've said about the UPA economic legacy, now the NDA government still 7 years into government says that they're actually still bearing the brunt or paying the cost of that debt currently. What's your take on that and the fact that of the reforms that the government has introduced, which the opposition, the Congress is opposed to, for instance, agriculture laws, which the NDA says is actually what Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia had actually brought in first, and now even with the national monetization pipeline, which the government says this was the Congress's brainchild.
I think, look, if I think about from my perspective, and from here I'm an outsider. I was never in government in these last 7 years, so I'm a commentator and jotter of columns and all that. I would, leaving aside the welfare programs, which by the way have been quite comprehensive, whether you think of the Jan Dhan's financial exclusion scheme, or the Swachh Bharat program, or Ujala and various other things, leaving those aside, thinking of more, hard economic policy, if you like, the ones I would pick up as significant reforms of the present government of the last 7 years are the GST, which previous governments had also tried to get through. But this government did get it through, though I think its actual implementation was not perhaps as good as it could have been and should have been. And that, in fact, led to some problems which compounded the costs of demonetization, which, if you call it a reform, it didn't work well, in my view. So GST I would mention. I would also mention the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Again, that I think has more promise than we have yet seen the outcome of because of various factors, including the onset of COVID, lockdowns and all this period, and the regulatory forbearance that came with it. And then third, as you mentioned, the agricultural marketing reforms, but which are kind of stalled at the moment or in abeyance. And then the labor codes, that went through Parliament relatively recently, again, potentially important and beneficial, but we don't yet know because the rules which really create the legislation on the ground have not yet been notified. Indeed, they have to be discussed between the center and the states, is my understanding. And that's where the fine print will show us how good or bad it is. And you also mentioned the NMP. So I think that these are important potential reforms, but they are very much work in progress. And the results as yet have not been great because they've been masked partly by COVID and lockdown and so forth. And partly because I think the nature of these reforms is somewhat different from the early 90s reforms, which were more like changing a few prices and so forth. Not quite so simple, actually. It's more complicated. But this is an issue which I would keep in mind. Mm-hmm. And what that means to me, in terms of looking forward, is that they're harder to continue to press on with and make a success of. And that again means that, and that is one reason why I'm bearish on my outlook for the next 5 years of economic growth and so forth.
Dr. Acharya, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective and, of course, on your new book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia.